That sounds good. And Hugh, I'm guessing you're joining on your phone because of the way around because of portrait versus landscape.
It's exactly that. Yeah, my laptop has fully given up on me for at least. So yeah, I'll be on my phone. So if you want my show, right.
I've got the slides that you sent me back. I'm assuming they're the most recent. Anyway, I'm hoping that'll be
perfect.
We're just allowing a bit of time, Kate, for people to join.
Yes, please. I think let's
share my screen then. My first panic is usually trying to find the right window, so just excuse me while I do that. There we go. It's always the last one. Right. Can everyone see that okay? Brilliant. I can see Kate's thumbs up, so that's a good sign. Yeah, nice to be here, everyone. Nice to be in something social. I feel I have the need for these now. Now I'm sat in my room. It's nice to kind of make some contact, albeit virtually. We should start with introducing ourselves to you, I guess. Do you want to go first, and then I'll follow up?
Sure, happy to. Lovely to see you all. My name is Hugh Spencer. I'm project manager for Be Well, and based in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority.
And I'm Jess Dayton, a director of the Evidence-Based Practice Unit, which is across UCL and the Anna Freud Centre, correspondingly director of Applied Research and Evaluation at the Anna Freud Centre, and a professor of child mental health and wellbeing at UCL. And Hugh and I wanted to talk to you today about, well, mostly about one particular project, I suppose, which is our lovely logo, Be Well. I suppose it represents a lot of thinking over the years, I suppose, about resilience interventions in schools, but also how you kind of focus the system a bit more around well-being of children and young people, and how you can put them front and centre in those discussions. So I will start with just a bit of framing. Some of that background won't be, potentially won't be new, but just helps you see where we were coming from with this piece of work. And then Hugh's going to talk through a bit more of the detail about the project. It'd be great to have your questions at the end, a nice bit of time for discussion, but also we've got some questions we'd quite like to ask you too. So let's see how we go with that as we go through anyway. So just to start with some framing, I always like to sort of just kind of give a sense of where we've come from and to in recent years with our understanding of mental health of school-aged children. So we spent a lot of time talking about 1 in 10 children and young people experiencing mental health problems. I feel like that was on every slide at the beginning of every talk, I think, for a long, long time. And then we had updated prevalence data in 2017, which told us that rate and jumped somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 9 children and young people experiencing mental health problems at any one point in time. And helpfully, that data also gave us a bit of a sense of some other aspects of help seeking and who young people saw as sort of sources of support. And what those data suggested was that although only 1 in 4 of those experiencing quite high levels of need that would qualify as sort of mental disorder, if you like, were accessing specialist mental health services, around about double that proportion were seeking help and support from teachers. So that's something I'll come back to later, and sort of has informed a bit our way of thinking about things. But just to stick with this sort of trajectory, I suppose, of mental health problems. So I think there was lots of kind of talk about mental health crisis. I'm not sure I'm quite on board with the language of crisis, but definitely what we've seen is a trend in children's mental health over time that appears to be incrementally worsening, which I think is something we all probably feel we ought to be paying attention to. And I suppose at the same time, we had a great report from the Children's Society this year, which also highlights it's not just mental health problems where we're seeing that increase, but we're also seeing quite steady decline over time in children's well-being and self-reported happiness. So again, I think that's quite a big statement if we're saying that that's just, it's quite consistently over the last 10 years really been going in the wrong direction. I think it helps when we're trying to think about prevention and turning things around to think about what are the sort of drivers and levers for mental health and wellbeing for children and young people. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just to say that there's a number of factors that increase the odds of experiencing mental health problems. We sometimes talk about them as risk factors, though sometimes they just represent an increased likelihood of experiencing a mental health problem. So it's not necessarily the factor itself that is driving the issue. There might be something else underpinning it. For example, economic pressures have lots of associated issues about where young people live, the stability of their homes, the sort of worries about making ends meet that their parents have, and that can link to some of the other risk factors here, like family conflict, for example, or parental mental ill health. So there's lots of different ways in which these kind of what we call risk factors actually play out. But yeah, I won't pick out too many there, but as you can see, there's sort of many that you might see as the sort of usual candidates there. So experiencing abuse or domestic violence, quite key, and loneliness and isolation, and more kind of discussion of academic pressures featuring what young people say affects both their mental health and their well-being. And on the flip side, lots of sort of drivers for more positive outcomes or what we would call protective factors. So lots of research suggesting supportive relationships are quite crucial, and not just having one key supportive relationship, but multiple relationships, and that those are spread across that sort of ecological environment for children and young people. So positive relationships with their family at home, with peers, and in the school environment. And also some kind of what we might call internal characteristics, like being able to regulate emotions well, some sense of sort of strong sense of identity, but also, you know, good connection to school and sort of positive expectations and engagement with the school environment. Oh, I can't seem to move slides. Hold on a second. There we go. So just sticking with, I've just highlighted a few there because I think school is now coming up again and again in terms of the usual candidates and risk factors and protective factors. And I think that's worth thinking about. I mean, it's begun to feature in the way the government thinks about how we support children's mental health and well-being. I'm sure lots of you will be involved in one way or other in the implementation of the Green Paper, in terms of mental health support in schools or those wider teams that integrate with schools. So that's definitely sort of becoming more commonly expected that schools provide that kind of support. We've also seen PSHE widening its remit to include mental health. And we're in fact trialling 5 different interventions in a DFE funded suite of trials, which is all about what kind of universal support can we put in place in schools. So all that feels like quite positive steps. But at the same time, we have the sort of flip side of the coin, if you like, where we see features of the school environment that have potentially changed perhaps over the same period as the decline we're talking about, although lots of other things have changed in that period as well. But talking about significant economic pressures for children and young people, sorry, not economic pressures, academic pressures for children and young people, and really, you know, feeling that test anxiety, but lots of pressure that that school and exam results are really the make or break moment in their life, and that feeling like they've absolutely got to get that right. And also at the same time, we see young people having less time, downtime and free time. So that includes, you know, some of that academic tuition and very structured kind of extracurricular activities seeping into what would be their free time, some of which is great, but, you know, we could question how much is too much. And also break times within schools actually being eroded. So, and also kind of reports of the curriculum potentially narrowing. So that environment feels a bit less sort of flexible and creative. And we hear young people talking a lot about that as a potentially challenging, and potentially makes it harder for them to feel like they're achieving well and they have a positive self-concept in that sort of environment. Sorry, there was one other, just so that's the sort of school context, and I suppose that's one of the things that might have changed over this period of time. I'm purposely not going to talk about social media. I think we could probably spend the whole session talking about that. That's obviously something else that's being talked about a lot in terms of risk factor for children and young people. But interestingly, during COVID also has been talked about as a potential protective factor. But obviously, COVID does in and of itself propose quite a large risk factor. So I just wanted to detour slightly into saying, what do we know about the sort of last couple of years and what impact that's had on children and young people? So we've had some updates on that 2017 study to tell us where we think the prevalence rates are with children and young people during the COVID period. And that seems to suggest that we've gone from around about 1 in 9 children and young people experiencing mental health problems to more like 1 in 6. So that is quite a significant jump, given the smallest jump that we had between 2012 and 2017. And what we see emerging from the evidence from this period is you can kind of define the impact on children's mental health potentially in 2 different ways. So one is really more about what we might describe as the kind of normal reaction to an extremely abnormal situation. So that's certainly in the initial period, increases in stress and worry around what threat COVID caused, worry about family members and others, and just general uncertainty about the future. Feelings of sort of lower well-being, lower sense of sort of life satisfaction. And also for those who'd been impacted in terms of family members perhaps being ill or even dying, there were definitely reports of grief and some traumatic sort of bereavement in children and young people. And also just a sense of sort of that loss of connection and loneliness, particularly in those lockdown periods. But as I mentioned, we have also seen an increase in prevalence in mental disorder or probable mental disorder, I suppose is how they're framing it. And that particularly seems to be focused into some areas. So increases in depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly for those directly affected by COVID, and also self-harm. And we could probably add some more to the mix, actually. The evidence is getting sort of more robust as we go. But that's a whole range of experiences that children and young people have had in the last 2 years, at a time when they've been less connected to their social supports, less connected to their community, and very much less connected to their school. So I guess the question is sort of where does that leave us now? What's the sort of current landscape and what are the potential opportunities really? Well, there have been some kind of examples of oh, sorry, I'm slightly jumping ahead of myself. I just want to say a bit more about, before I go on to what the advantages might be of the period, I want to say a bit more about disproportionately affected groups. So we can talk very broadly about prevalence and we can say, 1 in 6, but what's really clear from the evidence that's been emerging so far is that there really are disproportionately affected groups of children and young people. So while lots of young people have been largely unaffected or perhaps temporarily affected, and some have even reported actually slightly higher well-being during the period, there's definitely young people who've experienced more difficulty during this period. So particularly those who already have existing mental health problems, many of whom have reported real struggles with access to services and other sort of social supports that they had in place previously. Children and young people with educational needs or disabilities, particularly again, because sometimes services have been affected and some of those supports are within the school setting. So lockdowns have really affected their ability to access those. We're seeing, well, even more reports in recent months, I think, but throughout the whole pandemic, reports of children and young people of colour being more disproportionately affected in terms of actual risk of COVID, but also in terms of their mental health, probably as a result of the increased risk. But also children and young people from more economically disadvantaged backgrounds, obviously being more economic pressures and worries in those families, which, as I said, is related to a whole range of other risk factors. And those with social care needs, feeling that some of those social care placements are under threat or under pressure, and a lot of uncertainty around that. But we've seen some sort of real kind of rallying around of communities and schools in trying to think about how they meet the significant challenge posed by the period, especially where support has been scaled back, or there are sort of real practical challenges about how you do deliver support remotely, or in situations where, for example, you're having to clean a classroom between counselling sessions and that sort of thing. We've seen lots of online innovation. We've seen lots of thinking about how to provide opportunities for social connection. And in some areas and in some programs, we've seen real sort of innovative thinking around how that can be buttressed, given that some of the usual supports are sort of missing. We've heard lots of examples from schools about how they're trying to provide more support for parents and carers who've been in touch more over the lockdown period than perhaps before, especially with concerns and worries about their children's mental health. A lot of that has been sort of provision of kind of information materials, but also, you know, how can they provide those sort of remote resources that might be supportive. And we've seen schools thinking really hard about how to support their school staff, who they see as holding a lot of the burden and a lot of the responsibilities and pressures during this period, and a real increase in sort of thinking about how that can be done well and how that can be sort of understood, I suppose. So lots of challenges, but lots of really sort of careful thinking and interesting emerging practice. This is the bit I nearly jumped to too early. So thinking on the basis of that slight tour through the last few years, where does this leave us and where does it take us, I suppose? I mean, I think it demonstrates that we've been through a period where we've all been in the same storm, but potentially not in the same boat, that there are definitely disproportionately affected groups of children and young people. And I've named a few, but actually some of those young people may have been affected in ways that we don't understand, because we don't actually know what their experience has been over this period of time. And I think what that tells us is, really we've been in a period where jumping forward through we've been in a period where we've been somewhat blindfolded as to how young people have really experienced that period and what impact it's had on them. And that's a really tricky situation, particularly for schools to be in, because often they're so used to sort of knowing their students so well. So having that period of sort of limited contact makes that really challenging. But I suppose it's also been an opportunity, and I think that's an opportunity potentially to rebalance the system. Some of those issues that I mentioned before about this sort of sense of schools being a place for high stakes testing, a place where it's a sort of be all and end all situation where young people really have to achieve, and that pressure being applied. Can we use what we've learned over the last couple of years to rebalance that whole system towards well-being and towards thinking about more broadly the needs of children and young people? So I think I should hand over to Hugh at this point. Here I'm going to click to your next slide so that you can talk through where this takes us next. I think you're still on mute, Hugh.
Thank you, it's very helpful. With apologies to colleagues, my laptop crashed on me 5 times within 10 minutes before joining this call. So I'm on my phone. If you can't hear me at any point, please do shout and I can definitely rewind. But fingers crossed we can get through it. Lovely to be speaking to you all. I'm going to be drawing on the work that we're doing in Greater Manchester to come and put some of the ideas and themes that Jess has mentioned just there into practice. We're doing that in GM through a program called Be Well, which is essentially a collaboration between the University of Manchester, the Anna Freud Centre and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority to produce a wellbeing survey that we're going to roll out in years 8 and years 10 across as many secondary schools as possible this year. So it's currently in the field, and then repeat it for 2 further years, so autumn 2022 and autumn 2023. And then with any luck, do something positive with the results. So the survey itself has been co-designed by young people. So we're actually capturing the things that matter to them. And I'll talk a little bit about that process in a second. But the idea behind the process itself is that essentially schools will fill out the surveys, so young people will fill out the surveys. Then they'll receive confidential data reports from the University of Manchester, giving them insights into their young people's experiences of mental health and well-being. the ability to compare and benchmark with other schools in the region anonymously, and then also insights into inequalities and demographic changes and how different cohorts might change as well in terms of their experiences. There's then going to be follow-up support from the Anna Freud Centre and the Child Outcomes Research Consortium that we're very excited about in terms of how to put that evidence, how to put those insights into practice and linking to the evidence base. But then on top of that, we're also going to be publishing the data at a neighbourhood level. So there's 66 neighbourhoods in Greater Manchester, which essentially kind of communities of 30 to 50,000 population. And we're hoping to generate data at that level if we can get sufficient sample sizes, and then share that data with partner organisations to try and see what a whole system response to this sort of wellbeing measurement looks like. So what happens if we get statutory services involved in this, as well as schools, but actually what happens if we can unlock the power of the voluntary sector and make sure that wherever possible, the response to the Be Well data is community-led and youth-led, as well as evidence-informed. So that's essentially what we're trying to do through Be Well. On the next slide, I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail around how we've actually gone about designing the survey itself. If you don't mind just taking me on the next slide, Jess. Super. So this is hopefully the exciting part, and I'm going to pause for audience participation in a sec. So the Be Well survey and Be Well as a program has been co-created with young people. So they gave us our name, they designed our logo, they've also designed our sort of key kind of narrative points, and as well as that, they've designed the survey itself. So we worked with 150 young people over a sort of period of about 4 months. Across Pathfinder schools across Greater Manchester, including mainstream schools, but also pupil referral units, special schools, and independent schools. We essentially asked 3 questions, which was, what does mental health and wellbeing mean to you? What are the drivers of wellbeing, and what makes us thrive? And we took those outputs, passed them in through a questionnaire advisory group of academics, and used that to kind of create a structure for the survey. We then got some suggested measures from that questionnaire advisory group and took them back to young people and said, well, do you prefer this one or this one? Which one gets at what you're talking about? Which one feels more inclusive? Which one feels more accessible? And then it was peer reviewed by young people in youth organisations across Greater Manchester. And what we've essentially done through that is split our survey into domains of wellbeing and drivers of wellbeing. And the final output of that means that we'll have a sort of shared outcomes framework, which actually hopefully means it feels relevant to young people, feels inclusive for young people, and feels like it's actually asking the stuff that they want to ask about, want to talk about, so that when we're generating this data over the next few months, it's as impactful as possible. So before I go on to the next slide, I just thought, just in order to get your keyboards moving, as I said, we split it into domains and drivers of wellbeing. And I think Jess has already touched on the drivers, which interestingly map across quite closely, but really curious to hear what your thoughts are in terms of how young people might have characterized the domains of wellbeing. So how might they have answered, what does mental health and wellbeing mean to you? If you put your answers in the chat, and then we'll go on to the next slide and we'll see what we came up with through that process. So what might young people have said in terms of what do mental health and wellbeing mean to you?
I feel like we should have some sort of hold music or something while people type.
Confidence from Ursula.
Mm.
Yeah, feeling good from Lee.
Mm. Oh, there's a whole batch from Sue: feeling safe, being happy, feeling good, being heard. Yeah, good one.
Oh, we've had a couple of interesting ones. Oh, there we go.
Going very quickly now.
There we go. So we've had some interesting ones there around feeling like they can manage different situations, being able to cope, being able to talk, being able to be yourself. Awesome. I'll give you another 30 seconds. Good relationships with family and friends.
Still regulating emotion there somewhere yet. Feeling listened to.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, 10 more seconds. This is really, really good. Part of community, social connections, having choice. Excellent. Identity. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Nice. Right. Let's go on to the next slide.
Good. Okay. I've got a slight delay on slides, I'm afraid, Val.
No, it's absolutely fine. Okay. So this is what young people came up with as our Be Well domains. They went for meaning, purpose, and control. So things around autonomy, agency, life satisfaction, very closely related to choice, which we were talking about just then, but also actually young people saying agency is a huge part of their well-being. So unless we're actually designing this program, delivering this program with young people on board every step of the way, then it's not going to mean anything to them, because that's a big part of actually their well-being in and of itself. Emotions, as you might expect, so we sort of feeling good. So yeah, positive and negative affects certainly features. And then understanding yourself, which interesting came up a lot in the chat just there, was actually the single biggest thing that young people spoke about. So they talked about coping, they talked about regulating emotions, they talked about having the skills and the tools to support their own well-being. And that was massive for them. One thing that doesn't feature on here is relationships, but young people said that relationships, interestingly, was both a domain and a driver of well-being. So we ended up including it in the driver, but actually that's fundamentally part of their domains of well-being as well. So we'll go on to the next slide. And there you go. So here are the B-word drivers. We've got health and routines, hobbies and entertainment, relationships, the future, environment, society, and school. So hopefully that brings the survey to life a little bit. But basically what it means is by March time, we're hoping to have insights into all of these different things at a neighbourhood level across Greater Manchester. So we know the extent to which young people are engaged in physical activity, whether that be in South Manchester, North Manchester, Moss Side, Moston, Harper Hay, Wigan Town Centre, Oldham, etc., etc., etc. And we'll get that sort of really granular insight into those sorts of questions, into relationships at home, the extent to which they have places to go after school, how often can you do the things that you like to do in your free time, picking up on a thread earlier in the conversation. So we're really, really excited about that sort of holistic data that we're going to be generating through this, and some of the findings that we're going to be able to draw as a result. If we just go to the next slide, Jess. So this is all voluntary, which means that actually in terms of engaging with schools, we had a kind of big sign-up campaign from sort of May onwards to get schools to get involved. And actually we've been really, really thrilled at the amount of engagement from schools so far, despite it being such a busy period, and it's certainly not let up in the autumn months. But what we've had is 93% of mainstream secondary schools who've signed up to take part. That's at least 75% of mainstream schools in every locality, about 3 and 4 pupil referral units, a good number of maintained special schools. I've said that it's set to be the biggest kind of survey of its kind in the country. So it's 20,000 responses when I wrote these slides on Friday. It's now 26,500 slides. We've got 26,500 responses. We're going to be closing the survey window end of next week. So we're hoping for another final push on that front. And it's slowly starting to fit into the kind of Greater Manchester strategies as well, which we're really excited about, so that we can keep this whole system accountable to the results as they come out. Just on the next slide then. So a big part of what young people have told us around sort of the narrative around Be Well is they want us to, as well as sort of listening to young people's voices, acting together for change on those voices, they also want us to celebrate young people's well-being. And that's something that we've really taken to heart. So back in September, we had a Be Well Day where we had 200 young people from across the city region come together to take part in creative activities, physical activities, conversations around mental health and well-being. And we also had a bus, which is deeply exciting. So a young person asked us to drive a bus around Greater Manchester. So we duly tracked one down and drove it to 6 different schools. It was painted by young people in terms of what well-being means to them, and created this sort of big moving mural of well-being. But it's essentially a kind of what we hope that day as a whole, and the sort of the idea behind sort of celebrating young people's well-being is that we want to recognize that, yes, young people have been going through enormous challenges over the past 2 years, but we need to be building on a sort of strengths-based, assets-based approach to their well-being, involving in the conversations every day, from their, every step of the way, and wherever possible, kind of drawing out their strengths and celebrating that. So just on the final slide, if we can nip to it. This just gives a little bit of information in terms of what's happening next from our perspective. So as I said, survey window closes next week. We're then hoping to get reports to schools by January, and then the full neighbourhood data back out by March. That's going to be publicly available, so I'm hopeful we can share it with colleagues on this call if it's at all of interest. And then also, as you can imagine, there's a whole ton of thematic reports that we'll be hoping to develop, giving insights that will, I hope, have wider significance, or certainly a wider interest beyond Greater Manchester. So the University of Manchester, Anna Freud Centre, etc., will be working really hard on publishing those reports from sort of March 22 onwards. So that's pretty much it in terms of a Greater Manchester perspective. What I should say is that we're really excited about the potential of taking this beyond GM as well. So I'm hopeful there are some GM colleagues on this call, but we're also really keen that if we can show that this works, that this can start a sort of wider conversation around how standardized measurement of well-being, co-created with young people, with young people's voice at the heart, can create a bit of a step change nationally, but in other areas as well. I've just seen a question in the chat around, will the survey be publicly available? Yes, it's been published and people can use it from day dot, from right now if they'd like to, but we'd love to pick up a conversation about how that might work in practice as well. So this is our discussion points. We've got hopefully 10 minutes left. The three things we'd love to hear from you about is, what could this look like in your local area? How would you like to be involved in the work going forwards? And then finally, how can we ensure the response to the data is youth-led and community-led? So wherever possible, we've tried to make sure Be Well is youth-led, but we're really, really keen to make sure that going forwards, this isn't just a sort of one-off consultation, but this is the start of a conversation with young people about how to improve their well-being. So really, really keen to hear your thoughts on that front too. And I will stop there.
Thanks to you. Everything's on a delay, so every time I move a slide or unmute, it takes a while. I can see Kate's put a link to the survey and to in fact the Be Well website in the chat as well, so if people want to see more. Kate, I don't know, are people able to discuss, or do they have to do it via the chat? Sorry, I should know the answer to that.